Welcome to tonight's Aztlander program featuring Brad Lepper, Senior Archaeologist of the World Heritage Program. Your host, Jim Reed.
Well, thank you, Jim, for that kind introduction and for the invitation to be here with everybody tonight. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us this evening for this presentation on my collaboration with Chief Ben Barnes. The presentation is about that we believe Ben Barnes, through his ceremonial traditions, can shed and has shed through this research new light on some very old artifacts. Ideally, I'm giving the presentation with Chief Barnes, and we have done that on at least one occasion. But as Chief, he has so many more pressing responsibilities. I'm loath to make requests on his time. In many ways, the research I'm discussing tonight is, I think, the most consequential of any archaeological research I've ever been involved with. And that's simply because it does something that I used to think was not possible. It gives meaning to a number of 2,000-year-old artifacts based on the current ceremonial practices of the Shawnee Tribe that plausibly have been handed down over all those centuries. And although Shawnee leaders like Chief Barnes and like Glenna Wallace, chief of the Eastern Shawnee Tribe, they've never claimed to be the sole direct descendants of the Hopewell culture, but any of the tribes living in the Eastern Woodlands, and to some extent beyond that, would likely have ancestors who would have participated in building the earthworks, the Hopewell earthworks, and participating in the ceremonies that took place there. So this kind of research, this kind of collaborative research, is long overdue. This is a quote from Henry Rowe Cloud, a Ho-Chunk, addressing the annual meeting of the Ohio Archaeological and Historical Society, which we now know as the Ohio History Connection, in 1929, 94 years ago. And he's talking about here the archaeological research that the Ohio History Connection was so famous for back then. And he says, in addition to that, may we not be overlooking some valuable contribution from the lore of our first Americans? And this research that I'm going to talk about tonight overwhelmingly says, yes, we have been overlooking valuable contributions from that lore. And to some extent, the reason I mentioned before thinking it was impossible, I did extensive research in 2014, or at least that's when it was published in the Journal of Ohio Archaeology, into every account I could find of some European asking some American Indian from the early 1800s on up, what are these earthworks? You know, who built them? What were they for? And overwhelmingly, I think the most common answer was, we don't know, they were here when we got here. And that actually would have been literally true for some of the tribes like the Delaware, who had began in New Jersey and were progressively pushed west into the Ohio country. Another common explanation was their forts built by our ancestors when they were battling supernatural monsters. Well, that's clearly a folklore kind of answer. So I felt, based on this review, that yeah, understandably so, because of the great passage of time, because of intertribal warfare, the Beaver Wars in the late 1600s that displaced tribes from their homelands, because of European diseases that would have swept through even earlier than the Beaver Wars, with the trade taking place with the tribes further east that had contracted those diseases. European warfare, the consequences of that, forced relocations, later the Indian Removal Act and forced re-education, that it would be a wonder if traditions had been handed down that could be remembered, especially in the absence of written language. Like, you don't have a written Iliad or Odyssey. Oral traditions, I think, are really susceptible, particularly when the older people are dying from diseases, to being passed on over the span of time. So understandably, many contemporary American Indians, have no traditions that they say, oh yes, this is what the mounds were all about. And yet they may know things that they don't know they know. That is, some of the ceremonial practices that are contemporary may well have been originated much earlier and may perpetuate and may have passed on ceremonial practices that were current 2,000 years ago and that have perhaps changed in some ways, but still retain some of the elements of those earlier practices. But I could not have gone to Chief Barnes when I first met him and said, hey, what can you tell me about the Hopewell? Because there would have been no context and also no sort of established trust. Why would he share information like that with some archaeologist out of the blue that wanted this information so that I could publish an article on, sacred Shawnee knowledge? Of course, that kind of question has to wait. And well, I'll get to this more at the end. But these indigenous cultures were more resilient than I imagined. So this is entirely possible. And they held on to more than maybe even they realized. So the Hopewell ceremonial earthworks are what's represented here on that map. These are the sites, the key Hopewell ceremonial sites that we are in the process of nominating for World Heritage inscription. And the World Heritage Convention is going to vote on them later this fall. So we're all hoping that that's the case. And we have tremendous support from the Shawnee tribes and other American Indian tribes in this. But among the earthworks there, the one we're going to talk about tonight is Seip earthworks, the one in the lower left, part of Hopewell Culture National Historical Park. And the map on the right that I'm cutting some off of shows what's called the Hopewell interaction sphere that was a key component of the Hopewell civilization between about 1 and 400 CE. And this is why, when I said at the outset that any of the tribes living in the eastern woodlands and even beyond could have been on some level involved in these Hopewell achievements, because the Hopewell interaction sphere goes from the Gulf of Mexico to Wyoming to southern Canada, and objects made out of these raw materials, or perhaps the raw materials themselves rather, were coming to Ohio, to these Hopewell centers, where they were crafted into this amazing ceremonial regalia that is so iconic of the Hopewell culture. And my impression is that this represents a network of pilgrimage, that people from far and wide are coming to these Hopewell centers as pilgrims, bringing offerings of thanksgiving or supplication, and presenting those offerings at these Hopewell centers, and then going home with the transcendental experience of having been a part of the rituals there, perhaps even been part of building earthworks at these places. So the Seip earthworks are one of the several tripartite earthworks, a big circle connected to a little circle and a square. And there's a number of these. They're almost like cookie cutter forms. At the center of the big circle was this very large Seip Mound, 250 feet long. That's like a couple of city blocks, 30 feet high. That's like a 2-story building. So it was an enormous mound, and it covered what had been a great timber longhouse or ceremonial house, in which there were numerous cremation burials and many deposits of amazing artifacts. This shows the horribly crude excavation techniques of the time. They would use horse teams dragging scrapers and peel away the mound, and then sort of what they called dropping the side of the mound to expose another ridge of it. They were basically not interested much at all what was in the mound. They wanted to get to the base where all the supposedly good stuff was. Here's a few of the really amazing artifacts. Unfortunately, this isn't to scale. The copper axe on the right is huge and weighs, I don't know, 15 pounds or something or more. The sculpture of the Hopewell face there is ceramic and is very small. You could hold it in the palm of your hand. The tortoiseshell comb of the swan, perhaps, is amazingly delicate and beautiful. And that quartzite spear point over there is also very large. And that's just a tiny sampling of the artifacts. So here's the plan, the floor plan, once the mound had been reduced and all of the burial features exposed. Most of the rectangles are crematory basins, and almost all the human remains in this mound were cremated, with the exception on the far left of several extended burials of men, women, and some children on a special platform. And to the right of that, the oval, here I'm going to show an arrow there, that's the burnt offering. And it was a huge area where a whole bunch of regalia was deposited and burned and then buried, apparently while it was still burning. It's an amazing deposit. And then sealed later with a layer of clay. And then other cremations, or then later cremation burials were added on top of that clay floor. So that burnt offering, 9 by 3 meters by 23 centimeters deep, included more than 5,000 objects made from almost every exotic raw material in the Hopewell interaction sphere: copper, mica, marine shell, obsidian from Wyoming, steatite or soapstone, chlorite, quartz, bear claws, bear teeth, mountain lion teeth, shark teeth, alligator teeth, and the list goes on. That burnt offering, because of its association there on that far side of the mound with the great multiple burial, as Shetrone and Greenman called it, suggests that this might be possibly regalia that was part of the ceremonies involved with installing that great multiple burial and the ceremonies associated with that. And then all that regalia was destroyed before it was all then buried. Shetrone said, in spite of all of those wonderful things, obsidian, chlorite, the most interesting of all the artifacts in the offering, he thought, were these 5 steatite or soapstone spheres. They are small, they're about the size of a shooter marble, and each one of them has a different design etched into it. And Shetrone, in fact, claimed they were marbles. He and Greenman wrote that these engraved spheres were used as marbles and had been intended for the remains of the child buried in burial 13. They said he was a young boy and that he was probably the marble champion of the group, the tribe, amongst his peers, and was buried with his marbles. Well, that's all entirely made up. Shetrone, before he was an archaeologist, was a newspaperman. And apparently he made up a good story to go with these objects. And I'll demonstrate that everything's false. I mean, for example, even calling these things marbles, suggesting that as an option. Actually, first of all, the field notes for burial 13, the cremation there, state there were no artifacts associated with the child in burial 13, and the child could not be identified as male or female. The red X's there were where the spheres had been found, but they were found beneath burial 14 in that charred burnt offering. Then the clay layer had been added, and then burial 14 had been added to it. So it looks there like all those X's are associated, well, with burial 14, not 13, in fact. They're actually beneath it. They're not associated with it. And burial 14 was a cremation with age and sex unable to be determined. So not burial 13, not burial 14, wasn't associated with any burial except that they were in a massive burn deposit beneath those burials. And also, the game of marbles, Shetrone admitted, was not known in any historic American Indian tribes before European contact. So why would he think these 5 objects might be marbles? Well, because it was a good story. Well, that's where the story would have more or less ended, except for my repeated encounters over the years with Ben Barnes and other members of the various Shawnee tribes and other tribes. I'd probably been going out there for at least 3 years, And this might have been the third or fourth year I was out there. And we were meeting, many of the tribes were meeting at the Eastern Shawnee Tribe Cultural Center. That's where we were having this consultation meeting. And at a break in the meeting, I was being taken by someone that was responsible for the exhibits to look at some of the exhibits in the area. And one of them was an exhibit on the Shawnee drum. And I was looking at it, they were telling me about it. And at that same point, Chief Barnes was walking by. I don't know, he might on his way to get a drink of water or something, but he stopped and joined in the conversation. And then he started telling me about the Shawnee drum and about how it's made. And he said, when we go to make this drum for the ceremonies, it's a water drum. And so it's a ceramic or sometimes wooden vessel that they, with the opening, and they put water in it and stretch this leather hide over it and attach the hide to the drum, the barrel of the drum. And he said they do that using these perfectly round black stones that they go to a special place to collect. There's a picture of one of those stones, and on the right shows how this is done, that they wrap the stones up in the edges around the leather, tie it off, and then tie them all together and pull the cord beneath all those cords beneath the pot, or in this case, a metal kettle, and tie them all together that way. And I thought, now, I've seen objects like that. In fact, I told him at the Seip Mound, there were a number of these buried together, and they were all engraved. And I said, "Did you guys ever engrave yours?" And he said, "No." And he said, "How many are there?" And I said, "Well, there were 5. And he says, "Well, that would be a small drum, but in the Shawnee Tribe's traditions, it has to be an odd number, so that the tying them up and down and securing the drumhead works out that way." And so that began our conversation about these, that over the next couple of years, through emails and phone chats, we sort of pursued this research and eventually thought, this is important. This is, for the first time, we're offering an indigenously informed explanation of 2,000-year-old objects, and that this should be more than just a personal conversation. And Ben agreed that we would write a paper together about this and publish it. So here's an example of the drum. We actually use this in an exhibit that I'll talk about with those drum stones. So this is what it would look like all assembled, and each one of those little balls has one of those black stones inside it. But that shows how it's all assembled. Well, I began looking at how old are the traditions for a water drum. And as far back as 1624, Captain John Smith described an Algonquian water drum as a great deep platter of wood covered with a skin and tied at each corner with a walnut. Now, we'll come back to that description of this great deep platter of wood, so keep that in mind. David Zeisberger in 1780 described a Delaware drum as a thin deerskin stretched across a barrel, or in lieu of this, a kettle. Doesn't say how it was attached, but you could very much imagine that it was attached in the same way. Another avenue of research that Ben and I pursued was, is there any other evidence that there was a drum in Seip Mound? And so I began looking at the field notes, and I found a reference to fragments of a large wooden bowl or dish that Shetrone found close to where the steatite spheres had been. And when I remember emailing Chief Barnes about that, and was saying, "Oh my gosh, they had the whole drum and didn't even know it." It's possible that this large wooden bowl was in association with those, but it wasn't mapped in place, that they wouldn't keep track of things like that. So it's impossible to say now. And even worse, I've looked everywhere in the Ohio State Collection's collections to see if those fragments of that wooden bowl or dish are still preserved somewhere, to be able to look at it, measure it, see about what its size is. And I have never found any trace of it. So I can only assume that it deteriorated, was in poor condition, and was disposed of. But there are no notes in the collections to that effect. But then in the 1920s, they would have just pitched it out and not made any notes about it. So the water drum would have been particularly useful for Hopewell's big ceremonies because from things I've read about it, it has a very sort of a peculiar resonance and it can be heard for miles. So it seems to me that that may be one of the reasons why it was such a featured as opposed to a drum without water or whatever the kinds of drums there might be, and why this might have been featured so prominently in the ceremonial activities of these early indigenous people, and why that would have been maintained as such an important sacred drum for contemporary current rituals, ceremonies. And in fact, this is a painting by Ernest Spybuck, an absentee Shawnee artist, that shows ceremonies taking place. I'm not sure what period this is, probably 1930s, 1940s, something like that. And if you look close on the lower right-hand corner, you see the water drum with the balls tied up on the corners, just like the ones that Ben Barnes used, Chief Barnes and his folks use. So this is a continuity that goes back to historic times and even beyond, if Chief Barnes and my interpretation of these Hopewell artifacts is correct. And we submitted our draft paper to several journals, and I won't mention the names, but they were very prestigious journals in archaeology. And in two cases, before it was finally accepted, they sort of asked for revisions and then ultimately said no. Their basic argument was, you haven't proven that these objects are drumstones. And I was like, oh no, we haven't proven it. We can't prove it, but it's a better explanation than any other explanation than has been put forth so far. And it's an interpretation derived from the ancestors or people who could have been ancestral to the very people who made those artifacts 2,000 years ago. So on that basis alone, it would seem to me that it should have been considered worthy of publication, just as, you know, a means of bringing indigenous voices into the conversation. But no, we couldn't prove it. So this is a wonderful quote from Chief Barnes and there's his picture there, so you can finally see him. Seeing my own religious identity represented in a set of 2,000-year-old stones is powerful and profound. And that statement is even in our paper somewhere. And how peer reviewers could read that and not be affected by it and not see the importance of this research is beyond me. Although it is an emotional argument. And I suppose if you're, you know, sort of committed to the coldly rational scientific method, you know, maybe you do discount that. So our paper was finally accepted by the journal Archaeologists, which is the journal of the World Archaeological Congress. That's the first page of it. Ben is the first author, and I told him he should be the first author because there's no paper without him. All the stuff I'm writing about Seip Mound in there is background to the interpretation that he provided. I never would have come up with that on my own. We did make a temporary exhibit at the Ohio History Connection about this research that once the journal article came out, and it was a popular exhibit, but it was quite small. I hope to install this again as part of new interpretations when new exhibits about the indigenous history of Ohio are installed at the museum. I hope this can be a part of that. Now, I think this is my most important slide because here's, you know, for those of you that like want to replicate this, that want to do this, that want to involve indigenous peoples in your research. But the biggest lesson is I'm not really sure how this all came together. It involved years of sort of relationship building, and then just sort of a serendipitous meeting in the hallway and a discussion that it devolved from that. So, you know, I'm not really sure. I can't give anybody a roadmap to replicating this research. I mean, obviously, trust has to come first. We spent at least 3 years, I believe, going out to Oklahoma, listening, consulting, and then demonstrating with our subsequent actions that we were taking to heart the things we'd been learning out there. And I think that relationship of trust allowed what happened later to sort of go go to fruition. And it has to be about working together for a common goal. So it's not just the archaeologist wanting information that he can use to write his own or her own paper, about this. So, sorry, is there a question?
Are you looking at me?
Oh, never mind.
What?
So it has to be about working together for a common goal. And then this serendipity, it just has to come together. It just has to be that you come across the exhibit and stop in the hall and start chatting, and one thing leads to another. And again, I don't know a way to provide a roadmap for that other than Louis Pasteur's wonderful quote that chance favors the prepared mind. So you have this knowledge, you're exposed to an indigenous person offering information, and then you're able to sort of make those connections. The black stones that are about the size of marbles, I've read about those. I know we have those in our collections, but they're a little bit different. And then the conversation gets started. So yeah, there's no firm roadmap, but there's just these vague sort of guidelines. And sometimes the magic works and sometimes it doesn't. And now we're back to Henry Rowe Cloud. May we not be overlooking some valuable contribution from the lore of our first Americans. And I wish I'd had that quote when we were submitting it to those journals we were submitting it first. It's like, so you could say, yeah, we have been overlooking some valuable contributions from indigenous knowledge, and it's time to stop overlooking it. So I went through that kind of fast, but these are my acknowledgments. I thank Chief Barnes for his willingness to work with an archaeologist towards this common goal of shedding light on the ceremonial life of his ancestors. And Ben and I extend special thanks to Robin Duchesne, who was the Cultural Preservation Director for the Eastern Shawnee Tribe, who was giving me that initial tour of the Shawnee drum and the exhibit when Ben came by. So special thanks to Robin for sort of providing that serendipitous moment when Ben's walking by for us to build on that research. Now, I'm in some ways, I'm glad I got through this fast so that we can have more of a conversation here. I see there's already some questions in the chat, and I think Jim's gonna give me those.
Right. Well, thank you, Brad. That was quick and simple. One thing before I read any questions, the shark's teeth, they came from the Atlantic, and why do you think they were so important to people way far inland?
Of course, the indigenous people of Hopewell culture thought all these, especially carnivore teeth, were very powerful, spiritually powerful. And these like giant shark teeth and even smaller shark teeth would have had this, I think, inherent fascination, but particularly because, what in the world is this monster that has these giant teeth? It would almost be like finding dinosaur teeth or something. So those must have had very, very special significance.
I know their shark teeth are important to some of the Maya, especially Palenque, which is way far inland along a river, but in the mountains. But there was a type of shark that could swim 150 kilometers inland from the coast. And so that was something like the jaguar, like the rattlesnakes or other types of snakes that could kill man. The sharks could kill man. So they became a very, very powerful symbol and showed up in people's accoutrements and decorations, and even the name Lady Shook. In fact, that's where we get our name Shark from, is from Lady Shook at Palenque. But going to some questions, Monet seems very interested. Can you talk a little bit on the Havana Hopewell in Illinois? Is that where the Hopewell began to be known as what they are eventually to be named?
Yes, I would say the earliest stirrings, the sparks that would sort of take light and become this whole explosion happened first in the Havana in Illinois. But sort of this classic Hopewell in Southern Ohio is the real explosion that derives from that early beginnings. But yes, I think that's where it starts, is in Illinois.
Okay, so
and continues.
Hi, Brad. How are you? I don't think I've ever met you, but I know your work. So you're saying there's nothing earlier in Ohio than anywhere than Havana, right?
Right. There's only later stuff. So the dates for Havana are a little bit earlier than the earliest Hopewell in Ohio.
Okay. All right. Thank you.
Sure. Actually, Ken Nolan, Mark Seaman are coming out with, I've only heard about it, a new sort of really elaborate study of the chronology of Hopewell in Ohio in particular. And I'm not sure where that's going to be coming out, but it's coming out very soon. And I look forward very much to see this chronology refined. I mean, it used to be 100 BC to AD 500. Now we say like 1 AD to AD 400. And if I had to guess, I would say that is going to continue to contract. I don't think Hopewell was a very prolonged phenomenon. It seems to be the late Nomi Grieber called it the Hopewell explosion. And I think an explosion of that intensity is not something you can sustain for centuries. So I think the chronology of Hopewell is going to be contracted. Whether that's what happens in this new study by Kevin Nolan and Mark Seaman and perhaps others, we'll have to wait and see.
So Monet, did you want to say anything else? You mentioned they went to all the trouble of engraving the round stones, and then no one could see them.
Yeah, did you mention that about, they had this, each one of them was differently decorated, and then they went and they hid them inside these deer skins? Is there a reason?
Yeah, and Chief Barnes and I talked about that, and it seems it doesn't seem out of character at all for Hopewell, who had sort of these layers of esoteric knowledge with artifacts, certainly with the sites. Like the Newark earthworks has all these astronomical alignments encoded and these layers of geometrical knowledge. With one earthwork, like the circle that's connected to the octagon is the same area as the square that's connected to the great circle. And nobody's going to know that if they're just walking through the sites, for the first time as a visitor. So there's this hidden layers of knowledge. And I think those designs and where they are in the drum probably played a significant role at some level of initiation into those mysteries. But the designs were important, but they weren't supposed to be seen by everybody.
Yeah,
I mean, I think that's probably what it was.
It just points to the sacredness of them and the sacredness of the sounds that were created then from the drum. But now, I really, really love this idea of going to the people and finding out, is there any sources that we can read or look at that has more of this?
I mean, in terms of Eastern North America, Hopewell, this is like the only thing. Well, actually, there was another paper, can't remember the book, it was published with Rick Yerkes, Jay Toth, and Adrian Pepin. And that was research sponsored by the Seneca tribe. And they looked at the gigantic obsidian bifaces that the Hopewell created to see if they had any useware. And I think the idea from the Seneca was that these obviously weren't functioning spear points, since they're made out of glass and they're gigantic. Perhaps they were used in rituals, and Rick Yerkes and Pepin were able to determine that there was no useware at all. There was a bit of haftware, I think, at the bases, so they would have been probably hafted to poles, but they would have just been used as purely ceremonial,
Right.
which we would have guessed before, but it was just a guess. The work that the Seneca sponsored, that Yerkes and his colleagues did, showed that these giant obsidian bifaces were never used. So that's another sort of indigenous inspired research.
Right. I'd like to see a lot of that in writing so that I can, sit down and read it. I suppose you
Yeah.
but I guess that's coming, I hope. So,
Yeah, well, in terms of the paper I've written, if anybody wants to read that, just send me an email and I'll send you a PDF.
but thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
And Tom down in Merida is asking, how were the stones attached to the body of the drums?
Let me go back to that slide. That shows you on sort of the right hand there that they were wrapped around the edges, around the perimeter of the leather hide, and then tied off. And then they were sort of the cords then were pulled down below and around to the next one in this elaborate network that allowed them to sort of adjust the tightness and allow for, if it starts getting slack, you could tighten it up using this kind of mechanism.
And Mitzi out in the Northwest is asking, what about the mound in Vincennes, Indiana?
I've heard of it, but I don't know much about it. Don't know what was found in it or even what particular culture it belongs to.
And Gail Hansen from here in South Florida is asking, when was the Adena?
The Adena culture is the immediate predecessor of the Hopewell. It's named after the estate of Governor Thomas Worthington. And he said Adena was a Hebrew word that meant delightful place. And the first Adena mound, which is where the culture was defined, was on that estate. And so they named it after the estate. And I mean, it's not arbitrary, but in some ways, I mean, Hopewell is clearly an outgrowth, in Ohio at least, of Adena. So Adena are basically early Hopewell, or you could think of Hopewell as late Adena. But everything the Adena did in terms of an interaction sphere, in terms of building mounds, becomes like orders of magnitude bigger and grander with the Hopewell. So the Adena are sort of the early sparks, and the Hopewell are the raging cultural explosion that follows and comes out of it.
Thank you.
All right. Does anybody else have any questions or wants to unmute and ask Brad a question? Oh, Beth is in the chat feature sharing some interesting collaborative preservation of materials focused projects in the art conservation field. So Monet, maybe you'd like to take a look at that. And also a Cat dye project in Alaska. Thank you, Beth. Does anybody have any more questions? So Joelle is saying it sounds like the spark of the insights you gained came from the meeting in Oklahoma, serendipity and exposure to another culture. Given unlimited resources, what would you do to build the opportunities for these kinds of sparks in the future?
Wow, with unlimited resources, I suppose what would be wonderful is to establish in Oklahoma some kind of center for collaborative studies that you would give grants to grad students and established faculty to come out and have dialogues with indigenous scholars and indigenous peoples from various tribes and maybe build conferences around particular topics. I think that would be one way. But that's still trying to sort of go around the issue of building trust first. I mean, particularly like if a grad student came out and said, I've got this hypothesis that, these artifacts were used for this, and give me your traditions that will tell me that. Well, many tribes, and Chief Barnes is particularly sensitive about this, that with all the fake tribes that are trying to pretend they're Shawnee, every time the Shawnee Tribe, says something about their traditions, like if I give this program about how they tie these stones around and make their ceremonial drums, well, some, fake Indians will start making drums that way and claim to be Shawnee or claim to be having this through Shawnee traditions. So there's this wonderful, for me, use of this research to learn more about the antiquity, but from Ben's perspective and from the perspective of contemporary tribes, that can be dangerous, sharing in sacred knowledge of contemporary tribes, with a broad public in this way. So it's a complicated issue, and I think to answer that question, what I'd like to do is to go to Oklahoma and sit down with folks and say, I've got unlimited resources. What do you want to do? How can we do this together in a way that makes sense for everybody?
That sounds good.
I just need those unlimited resources. So if anybody has that in their pocket, let me know.
Are there any examples of trade with Florida?
There are some, the most of the examples I know that relate with the Hopewell connection aren't necessarily trade, but they are earthwork sites like Fort Center in Florida's Hopewell period. And I believe it's a circular ditch around a site of this period. And the diameter of that circle is the same diameter, 1,200 feet, as the Great Circle at Newark. So there's Hopewell-like activity going on. And there's Hopewell-like activity going on all over Eastern North America in different pockets. And Florida is one of those pockets. But I've never seen, for example, a piece of coral in an Ohio Hopewell site. But there are alligator teeth. So those could come from Florida or, even some of the more, a little bit further northern states too as well.
Yeah, anywhere around the lower Mississippi.
Yeah.
All right, well, questions seem to have planed off.
Well, then they don't have to end here. Anybody that thinks of a question wants to email me and have another conversation about something, let me know.
You want to say your email address then?
Sure, I could just put it in the chat if you want, but it's just my name, B for Brad, and then Lepper at ohiohistory.org. So blepper at ohiohistory.org. And you could probably find that online anyway, so by searching for it.
Thank you, Brad Lepper. And this is all dedicated to Ben Barnes, Chief of the Shawnee Tribe. And thank you, viewers. Please subscribe to our Aztlander YouTube channel. To subscribe to free monthly issues of the Aztlander e-magazine, contact your host, Jim Reed, at mayaman@bellsouth.net.